everybody. I'm very pleased to participate in this little course with you on Philanthrocapitalism and global health, the power of agenda setting. My name is Anne-Emanuelle Birn. I'm a professor at the University of Toronto, where I teach global health politics, the history of international health, and critical development studies. So to begin, we might turn to the wealthiest men in the world, wealthiest people, they are all men, and ask what they have to do with global health. Well, you can certainly see 6 of them are American, although we do have Amancio Ortega Gaona, head of the Spanish fashion enterprise Zara, and Carlos Slim of Mexico Telecom fortune. All the rest are from the American investment software media enterprises. So you have Mark Zuckerberg, ubiquitously from Facebook, Jeff Bezos, who founded Amazon, Larry Ellison, the Oracle software company, Michael Bloomberg, who was both the former mayor of New York, but his capitalism and philanthropy derived from the media Bloomberg business empire. Of course, Bill Gates from Microsoft, and Warren Buffett here, who is an investment guru. All of them have an interest in some fashion in global health and humanitarianism, whether it's investing in medical advancements, such as Zuckerberg and Ellison, whether it has to do with support for Red Cross, global health, as in the case of Gates, Buffett, and Carlos Slim and Bloomberg, and so on. Now, another way of looking at this is the way Oxfam does, and that is portraying these 8 mega trillionaires as the epitome of inequality. In fact, these 8 people own the same wealth as half of the entire world's population. So you might argue that in order to advance global health, we might not even concern ourselves at all with their philanthropy, but call for a redistribution of their vast, colossal wealth to the half of the population that has virtually nothing. I will leave that for you to contemplate. Let's look at philanthropy itself. The Oxford English Dictionary defines philanthropy as the desire to promote the welfare of others, expressed especially by the generous donation of money to good causes. And this is from Latin and Greek, the idea of loving human beings. But, and here's the rub, it's not necessarily to love all humans sincerely, equally, or to love people more than loving making money. So first we might ask, why are philanthropies or foundations created in the first place? So certainly this is to advance the objectives of the founders. This may include achieving broad humanitarian goals, altruism, generosity. Certainly it's a means in many countries of lowering personal taxes, corporate taxes. At the same time, this means that philanthropies are publicly subsidized because those monies otherwise would go into tax coffers. Philanthropies also improve the image of corporations and their owners, and is very effective, or has been, at staving off criticism of the super rich, of these magnates. And so ultimately we may think about philanthropy as both preserving capitalism and resolving its contradictions, and along the way expanding markets, promoting business industry, particular industries, and capitalism writ large. So you can think about philanthropies, depending on your perspective, as some combination of the above reasons, But regardless of your stance, what's extremely important is there's no public accountability of philanthropic actions, even though much of these monies are arguably from public coffers. That is, they would otherwise go into taxes and be distributed via government mechanisms. And just as a little reminder, Capitalism 101 here, there really is no excuse for ignorance or naivete, and you don't need critics to tell you what capitalism, how capitalism functions, what its purpose is. You can turn to capitalists themselves, and here we have John D. Rockefeller Jr. Talking about Standard Oil, and he says, "We are not in the business of producing oil, we're in the business of making money." So regardless of the corporate social responsibility claims of these large or small corporations, their aim is money-making. And if it's a large corporation or even a small corporation, as long as it's publicly traded, this is actually a legal obligation. Corporations have a fiduciary responsibility to maximize profits for shareholders, right? So that's a legally binding condition of doing business. Now, where does the combination of philanthropy and capitalism emerge? Certainly we can think about this historically, and we will look at this in a few minutes, but the term itself emerged a few years ago, about 10 years ago, by a reporter for The Economist, Matthew Bishop, and a co-author who penned a book called Philanthrocapitalism, How the Rich Can Save the World. And this was extolling the benefits of philanthropy for the good of the planet, including the capitalist good of the planet. Now, this was 2008, just before the Great Recession and the financial implosion on Wall Street. So it's very interesting. The very first edition had the subtitle, How the Rich Can Save the World. But in the next edition, after the events of 2008, the rich were taken out of the subtitle. And so it was turned into How Giving Can Save the World. And here, even the capitalists recognized that they had lost any kind of legitimacy after the Wall Street fiasco of 2008 and the associated events. That said, the idea of philanthrocapitalism really comes from this dual effort, both on one hand, to try to portray capitalism itself as a potentially philanthropic activity, and at the same time to infuse capitalist values, so the ideas of venture, philanthropy, and investment into philanthropy. So here you have both sides, really, of philanthrocapitalism. And I will leave it to you to decide whether this is a synergistic, felicitous combination or an oxymoron. So how can you be giving generous donations to the benefit of humankind while at the same time serving to advance the interests of capitalism? So you can see for capitalism as philanthropy, on one level you have the idea of continuing profiteering, right? So the idea is that there's no problem with capitalism as carried out currently, just there needs to be a little bit of generosity on the margins in order that just a small proportion of the profits go to resolving some of the worst contradictions, extreme poverty that is generated via the capitalist system. And consumers are roped into this approach. And here you see rock singer, U2 lead singer Bono's ideas around the Red Manifesto. So continue shopping, and a very small amount of your purchase price will go to the philanthropic deeds decided upon by the philanthropists. At the same time, we can look at philanthropy as capitalism. And so a large number of corporations actually run their own foundations. Oil companies, pharmaceutical companies, food companies, and so on. And so typically these are funded by corporate profits that are deducted from corporate taxation, and often donating, for example, in the pharmaceutical realm, drugs and products that are almost expired and would not be able to be sold in any case. Certainly there's often public relations and marketing and the idea of developing new markets for products. And then some of these corporate foundations actually operate near their own factories, near their own pool of workers. So the mining industry has become well known for philanthropic or pseudo-philanthropic investments to ensure that local populations will not oppose mining efforts. So again, around this concept of corporate social responsibility, which has become so popularized in recent years, we can cite Milton Friedman, who was the original Chicago boy, the free marketeer extraordinaire, father of neoliberalism, and President Ronald Reagan's chief economic advisor. And what he said was asking a corporation to be socially responsible makes no more sense than asking a building to be. That it is a complete absurdity. So let's unpack some of the ideas around capitalism. On one level, we have huge sums of money committed to philanthropy that are subsidized, tax subsidized, or tax deducted, as already mentioned. And these are thanks to the absolutely enormous profits earned by a very small number of people in real estate, commodity, mining, extractive industries, technology, finance, and so on. And in the most recent guise from the 1990s onwards. So the subtext of this story is that the riches have been built on and actually legitimize rising inequality. Ironically, in proportional terms, the middle and working class population is far more generous than the wealthy. The other side of this is this idea, as mentioned previously, that business approaches can resolve social problems, maximizing instead of economic returns, social returns, and the assumption that business approaches are superior to government and civil society efforts, that they're more efficient, effective, closer to the people, and so on. The subtext being that they're underpinned by neoliberal deregulation, privatization, the externalization of costs, and then this myth of markets as infallible, even as many philanthrocapitalists, certainly from the corporate sector, end up marketing their own goods and services. So the faith that these approaches can save or change the world, we might reread as, instead of having democratically organized and accountable welfare states and systems of redistribution, we have a system of the rich knowing best. So what does this all mean for democracy? Is this a healthy approach? Why, we might ask, should the ultra-rich, who already wield enormous economic power, also determine social priorities? And here I turn to the former Secretary of Labor under former U.S. President Bill Clinton, Robert Reich, who said governments used to collect billions in taxes from tycoons and then decide democratically what to do with the money. And I want to pause here and say this emphasis on the U.S. and North Americans, it really stems from philanthropy and philanthrocapitalism, in particular, absolutely residing in the U.S. context. Philanthropy was essentially foundations. This approach was essentially invented in the United States, and the U.S. has far more, by volume, numbers, proportion, philanthropists than any other part of the world, even as our 8 billionaires from the second slide included one person from Spain and one from Mexico, all the others from the US. So what are the historical roots of this US philanthropy? Andrew Carnegie, the famous steel magnate, having made his great fortune, decided that there was an obligation on the part of the wealthy, on the part of these magnates, to distribute some of their profits, their gains, to the public good. So this he dubbed the gospel of wealth. So he invested enormous amounts in building libraries and public bathhouses, as well as peace, education, science, across North America. Then John D. Rockefeller, the oil magnate and the original Standard Oil, Esso, or Exxon company founder, had the idea of taking this a step further and developed the arena of what we might call scientific philanthropy, starting in the 1890s. So not simply to donate money to particular endeavors, but really to try and reshape these fields. So education, he helped found the University of Chicago and Rockefeller University in New York, dedicated particularly around what we call today biomedicine. A great interest in harnessing medicine and public health to the public good, but in particular to the good of capitalism, to create healthy workers for the advancement of capitalism, as well as healthy consumers across the world. And curiously, he had a fellow named Gates advising him, no relation to Bill Gates, but Frederick T. Gates was a Baptist preacher who advised Rockefeller in both his business and his philanthropic interests. Now, it's quite interesting to note that in the United States, these philanthropic efforts actually helped to delay the development of a welfare state, really until the Great Depression of the 1930s. So curiously, today Americans donate over $300 billion a year, yet spend just 6.5% of gross domestic product on Social Security, that is measures that are redistributed in at least a somewhat progressive manner. And most other countries spend at least twice the proportion on these redistributive social benefits. I just want to give you a sense of what the public thought about philanthropists over 100 years ago. This is from a workers' journal called The Comrade from 1901. And they portray so-called Christian philanthropy as a business fat cat who is stealing money from the worker, who's literally greasing the wheels of capitalism and then just donating a little bit of it to a hospital. And just in case you don't understand, as the viewer of this cartoon, that this is being portrayed as the worker being robbed in a very cynical manner, you have the statue named Cynicus. So, as mentioned, John D. Rockefeller was really the first to systematically invest in science, medicine, and public health from this philanthropic influence. And his grant making since 1913 is the equivalent of about 50 billion US dollars. Much of it spent, at least in the global health arena, in the first half of the 20th century rather than the second half. So 13,000 public health, sanitary engineering, and nursing fellows were trained across time. About 93 countries and colonies experienced public health programs where institutions, ideas, practices of public health were disseminated. Some 25 schools of public health around the world were founded by the Rockefeller Foundation, including Universidade de São Paulo, USP, the University of Toronto School of Public Health, where I work, the Peking Union Medical College in what is now Beijing was founded, as well as a means of trying to bring Western medicine into China before the Chinese Revolution. And then in the agricultural arena, the Green Revolution was launched by the Rockefeller Foundation in Mexico, involving both the use of hybridized crops, big equipment, and advanced agricultural techniques, and creating kind of an agribusiness model that eventually displaced, and this model continues to displace in Africa, many parts of Asia, and continuing in Latin America, small farmers. And finally, the Rockefeller Foundation advised and sponsored the work of the League of Nations Health Organization, the UN Relief and Rehabilitation Agency during the Second World War, and the World Health Organization and the Pan American Health Organization. And here it's quite interesting. The Rockefeller Foundation actually saw the public and multilateral system of intergovernmental system of international health organization as highly desirable. And after WHO was founded, actually pulled out to a great extent of international health investment and spending, believing that its efforts from a philanthropic perspective were no longer needed now that there was this strong intergovernmental organization that was charged with promoting health as a human right. Now, the Rockefeller Foundation developed a series of principles of international health cooperation, which in many ways continue to govern the field of international health. So these include what we might call agenda setting from above, the idea that international health activities are donor-driven, with relatively little say on the part of local populations, and often very little on the part of governments themselves. And this is in the standard north-south kind of cooperation, or large country, small country cooperation, or on the part of international agencies. And this might take place through activities within countries or awarding of grants. A second principle is budget incentives, and that is that the International Health Agency or philanthropy only partially funds the health activities, and it is the responsibility of government counterparts to match this funding mechanism. And so substantial financial, human, physical resources would be obligated on the part of the cooperating entity. And so this is another means of the agenda setting actually controlling and influencing much of health spending by countries and localities. A third and very important principle is its technobiological paradigm or underpinnings. So this is the idea that activities are understood in terms of individual behavioral and biological means or understandings of disease rather than social and political understandings integrated with these biological and behavioral perspectives, and the utilization of technical quick fixes, so tools that can be applied to a wide range of settings, almost as a recipe. So DDT is a classic example of this approach, or smallpox vaccine, as you can see portrayed here, or the use that the Rockefeller Foundation made of hookworm campaigns, for which they had a very ready medicine that was used to diminish the number of hookworms that resided in the stomachs and the bellies of undernourished and rural peoples without access to adequate sanitation. Now, the idea that poverty was the cause or the root determinant of ill health and should be addressed in combination with the technical tools was not advocated. And so you really have this division of this technobiological approach from what was understood in terms of social medicine in previous eras, as well as in the contemporary era, as the importance of integrating the technical with the social or socio-political. The fourth parameter or principle is this idea of success decided in advance. So bounding activities geographically via time limits, by disease and intervention, and with clear exit strategies, so that it would be absolutely certain that activities would be efficient, so wouldn't be slowed down by reluctant populations, for example, and that there would be visible positive outcomes. So more challenging problems, such as addressing tuberculosis, especially before the appearance of streptomycin. So tuberculosis would need long-term investment, housing, in nutrition, and poverty, reducing poverty overall, would not be a priority of the Rockefeller Foundation in the first half of the 20th century. Another very interesting principle is that of developing consensus via transnational professionals. So many, we saw the 13,000 fellows were trained, often physicians, often trained at Harvard, Johns Hopkins, or the London School of Hygiene, many nurses trained at my university, the University of Toronto, and they would then be involved in international networks and translate some of the approaches of the Rockefeller Foundation to the local scene or setting. Now, I think it's important also to take into account the final principle, which is that of adaptation of activities to local conditions as needed. So it wasn't simply that there was a pure top-down approach regardless. Of course, interactions, adaptation based on particular countries, so on, the interests of leaders, particular groups of people, and so on, were taken into account, right? But this was not what the Rockefeller Foundation entered with. This happened by natural course of the way in which the activities unfurled. There's no way that they could have simply come in and imposed. Quiero tomar una pausa para tomar.
Oh, yeah.
So what does philanthrocapitalism look like today? Here you see a variety of philanthrocapitalists, Rockefeller Foundation still here, again, many others from the tech industry, pharmaceutical, Wellcome Trust, and certainly not all are Americans. The Aga Khan Foundation out of Pakistan, Stiftung out of Germany, Britain, Instituto Carso out of Mexico, and so on. But you can see the very close relationship between philanthrocapitalist interests in global health and political power, such as at the World Economic Forum. So the Rockefeller Foundation itself has transformed enormously. So while in the past it was very much interested in public health becoming part of the responsibility of government and having a very strong multilateral system of international health governance, today its focus is far more on the private sector. So here you can see in its interest in universal health coverage is around harnessing the resources of the private sector to finance and deliver health services. So this privatization imperative. And even more jarring is its interest in impact investing. So this idea that you can address social and or environmental problems through impact investing and at the same time turn a profit. Right? So philanthrocapitalism as a profitable venture as well. Other major philanthropists, such as Bloomberg, focus on a variety of public health concerns. Tobacco is one of Bloomberg's key interests. And you can see this incredible confidence that he exudes. We know it works. We've had a tremendous impact in our work. And we believe that our work can create better, longer lives for the greatest number of people, right? And applying the most important lessons learned in the private, public, and philanthropic sectors. And again, here we have this idea of governments failing to recognize people dying from preventable causes, and so philanthrocapitalists need to step in. Now, some of you may wonder, this is quite extraordinary that Bloomberg would actually make this statement. Is it that governments have failed to recognize problems such as tobacco, or is it the power of the tobacco industry, which for so long has tried to manipulate public policy around the harms caused by tobacco? And even, as you may know, in recent years, the tobacco industry sued the country of Uruguay because it was following WHO's Framework Convention on Tobacco Control, which called for covering tobacco packets, cigarette packs, with large displays of the harms caused by cigarette smoking. A most recent entrant into philanthrocapitalism is by the Chan Zuckerberg Initiative. This is just at the end of 2015 that they entered the arena, and the idea is through a limited liability company trying to cure all disease by 2100. And again, you see the self-confidence, even the arrogance of using biologists, scientists, engineers, and technologists to invest without looking at social conditions and conditions of inequality. Now, the venture philanthropists or philanthrocapitalists also have an enormous hold over the media and shaping public ideas around health. So some of you may read the British newspaper The Guardian, and you see it has a big section on global development that is heavily funded by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, but also I stumbled recently on this article about arsenic in the water of Bangladesh, and I saw this article was supported by the Fundación FEMSA. So the Fundación FEMSA focuses on nutrition, education, and care of water. So I started to get curious, who's FEMSA? It turns out that they are the largest public bottler of Coca-Cola products in the world, starting in Latin America. And you see the absurdity of the Coca-Cola Company profits funding nutrition education, given that Coca-Cola itself is nutritionally empty, if not positively harmful, and care of the water supply, which Coca-Cola often displaces in rural areas where there are no clean water systems, and even in urban areas across Latin America and much of the world. So let's now turn to the largest philanthrocapitalist in global health of them all, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, or BMGF. So as you know, software purchases at work, and this wonderfully progressive rhetoric around reducing global health inequities, buzzwords about respect, humility, fairness, ethical behavior, and so on. And the sheer scale of this foundation is extraordinary. It's the largest philanthropy ever, $40.3 billion, including $19 billion donated by the investor Warren Buffett. And the Gates family, plus Buffett, are the only trustees of this foundation. And again, sounds so heartwarming, the idea that the global health mission of ensuring that life-saving advances are created and shared with those who need them most. And here you can see, again, some of the confidence of Bill Gates and his foundation in improving the health of African children, proving one thing: global health spending works. Or in the case of the foundation writ large, you can see the enormous sums spent on global health. So in its first 15 or more years, $15 billion spent on global health, and again, an enormous amount on techno-biological approaches to HIV, malaria, tuberculosis, and its global development efforts, really focusing on polio eradication, vaccine delivery, maternal and child health, family planning, and agricultural development. So you have this massive, massive investment in global health, and it's absolutely ubiquitous, with ever-expanding tentacles into children thriving, saving lives at birth and saving brains effort, new interventions for global health, putting women and children at the center of development, and so on. And here you see from the annual newsletter of the Gates Foundation these touching images of Bill and Melinda Gates on the ground level, as though they are absolutely equivalent to the photogenic yet poor families who are portrayed here. And the idea, improving life for the poor, will take contributions from everyone. Of course, their contributions are, and the philanthrocapitalist contributions are proportionately far smaller contributions that the majority of the world's population is contributing. So you have this sense of moral piety. I don't know that solidarity would be the appropriate way to portray this. And again, you see this notion: we make the future sustainable when we invest in the poor, not when we insist on their suffering. For those of us who believe in the value of every human life, there isn't any more inspiring work underway in the world today. But what is really going on with the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation? If you look at one of their first large initiatives, the Grand Challenges in Global Health, which were issued in 2004 and 2005, you see a whole range of very reduced technical approaches of improving childhood vaccines, insect vector control, and even improving nutrition to promote health has to do with a technical intervention of creating optimal bioavailable nutrients in a single staple plant species. So as long as manioc has all the vitamins in it possible, there's no need to improve the lot of small farmers or have subsidies for nutritious food. All poor people need to eat would be one item as long as it's bio-optimized. And so we have to ask also, what are the conflicts of interest that the Gates Foundation is engaged in? Certainly as a global citizen, the Gates, through his investment and leadership of Microsoft, was very much backing and continues to back the idea of intellectual property as private property. So long periods of time for patent protection for pharmaceuticals, for example, even though enormous public monies are invested in developing new medications. The Microsoft Foundation's largest clients have long been the US and the British military. And of course, the Gates Foundation itself is heavily invested, its endowment is heavily invested in polluting industries. There's also a conflict of interest around big pharma. Now, a number of years ago, the Gates Foundation actually pulled out its own investments from big pharma, perhaps because of the critiques. But the Buffett donations to the Gates Foundation continue to reside in big pharma. And so that would be Johnson & Johnson, Sanofi, Aventis, and so on. And all of the recent global health program directors, Yamada came from GlaxoSmithKline, Mundell from Novartis, have come from the pharmaceutical sector. And so there's been this very close relationship between the promotion of pharmaceuticals and global health. And even the HPV vaccine, which has been controversially heavily promoted in India, and one of its producers, Merck, you could argue, are in a conflict of interest situation because Buffett monies are invested in Merck. Now, the African Green Revolution, or the Alliance for a Green Revolution in Africa, also sees some of these conflicts of interest. Again, Gates Foundation, Buffett Foundation endowment invested in Monsanto, Procter & Gamble, Coca-Cola, all of which are benefiting a great deal from the Gates global health activities. But the greatest conflict of interest is really that which prevents our United Nations or entities, agencies, from operating in the public interest. You all are familiar with the G8 organization of countries, G20. So some years ago, an H8, Health 8, was created, which is arguably more than 3/8 Gates, if not more than half Gates. So the Gates Foundation is one of these 8 entities that meets around priority setting together with these UN agencies. But the Gates Foundation is also heavily influential in UNAIDS, the World Health Organization. In addition to the 2 public-private partnerships, it helped to launch Gavi, the Vaccine Alliance, and the Global Fund. And let's focus for a few minutes on these 2 entities. So the Global Fund was launched to address AIDS, tuberculosis, and malaria problems outside the guise of either UNAIDS or the World Health Organization. The idea was to bring private sector monies into this arena, have countries receive grants but be overseen by this public-private partnership rather than by public entities themselves. So its launching grant came from the Gates Foundation, which has donated $1.6 billion to the Global Fund, which has now dispersed almost $34 billion to 1,000 programs in over 140 countries. It bypasses UN structures, as mentioned, also offering lucrative business opportunities. So what the Global Fund enables that WHO efforts did not is for the private sector to get a big piece of the global health action. Right? Historically, this was not the case. Incredibly, given what the Global Fund is aimed at, neither the World Health Organization or UNAIDS are represented on its board, whereas the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and Big Pharma are board members. Now, you could argue that neither should have a single form of representation, given that each represents virtually all countries in the world, and so that there should be hundreds of votes for the countries, right? Not just one representation via WHO or UNAIDS. Gavi, the Vaccine Alliance, is a PPP that is similarly problematic. This one was founded directly by Bill Gates and has received $4 billion from the Gates Foundation since 2000. It funds the private pharmaceutical sector to produce vaccines for low-income countries. And the idea is that big pharma profits will be ensured and pharmaceutical companies will remain interested in the diseases of low-income countries, which they are not necessarily interested in because they're not seen as profitable. So the profits of pharma are in many ways prioritized over local needs, such as in furthering the penetration of the HPV vaccine, which is far from a leading priority in many countries. Still a priority, just not one of the most important investments that folks would want to be making, especially given the high price of the vaccine once countries graduate out of the Gavi system. There are a set of dubious incentives, contracts, guaranteeing markets for pharmaceutical companies when they invest in these areas. Now, you might say, well, look, this is enabling pharmaceuticals to put money into areas that otherwise they wouldn't invest in. But is it not the roller coaster of capitalism, the potential risk as well as the potential profit, what should be driving it? If capitalism has guaranteed profits, then it certainly doesn't, that's corporate capitalism, right? But it's certainly not capitalism as it's ideologically portrayed in this competitive fashion. And again, and here you can see the board representation for Gavi has a very large private sector involvement. So you've got the vaccine industries in both developing and developed countries, one seat for civil society organizations. Here you do have UN agencies and donor countries as well as so-called recipient countries represented, but also, again, heavy private sector representation. So arguably, the World Health Organization itself has been co-opted through partnerships, and here you see a few of them portrayed here. There are literally hundreds of them and dozens of large ones. During the Cold War, certainly there was great influence by Western US-controlled countries, but this was checked by the World Health Assembly and its annual meeting and votes over key policy issues. Today, about 80% of WHO's budget is earmarked by donors, often operating through these PPPs. And despite the idea, and here this is a very important point, despite the idea that that PPPs are bringing money, private money, into global public health spending, actually most PPPs channel public money into the private sector for private purchasing of, in the case of Gavi, vaccines, as opposed to the other way around. So it's actually a means not of private spending, but of public spending to private ends. And you have a whole range of problems associated. Again, donor-driven efforts, they're duplicative, vilify the public sector, they're unaccountable, and there are a whole series of conflicts of interest. So ultimately, you have private interests compromising the public health agenda, providing legitimacy to corporations' activities through their association with WHO and other UN agencies, and they focus on short-term, top-down approaches on technological, profitable interventions and privatization of essential services. Now, just to give you a sense of the proportion of all of these activities and how much still resides in the public sector, despite the appearance of global philanthrocapitalists, I want to show you this slide. And the Gates Foundation is dark green here. Of course, Global Fund and Gavi in purple are also important players, but remember, most of the monies going into these, as going into the global health field writ large, remain in public hands, are from the public sector. So here you have the Gates Foundation spending about 10% of global health investment. So if we think of $36 billion in 2016, about 2 or 3 billion, again, depending on the year, coming from the Gates Foundation itself, or being channeled through it, and can certainly help drive spending upwards. But again, this is private influence over largely public spending. And so it's not enough to say, well, it's all the fault of the Gates Foundation. Rather, it's the fault of lack of transparency and public accountability of the partners, the public partners, the government partners. And you can see here that the World Health Organization has in many ways been displaced by these partnerships. The Global Fund, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, Gavi, World Bank, and so on, far outspending the World Health Organization each year. So I just want to briefly compare the Rockefeller Foundation in the past, not as it currently acts, but as it did in prior decades in the first half of the century, to the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation today, to give us a sense of what global health looked like in the age of imperialism versus the age of neoliberal globalization. So first of all, as mentioned, the Rockefeller Foundation set the principles of international health, left a real legacy. It was the sole major player in international health in the first half of the 20th century. It left footprints on key international health institutions such as WHO and on national public health departments across the world. Yet it was open to some progressive ideas and at the time, again, very much favored public investment in public health. Of course, backed market expansion in the imperial context, but proffered claims on the state and the state's responsibility. Today, the Gates Foundation, in an age of neoliberal globalization, while following most Rockefeller principles, underscores the primacy of the private, of venture philanthropy. So you have the influence of the Gates Foundation in some ways tempered by the existence of many other institutions and the existence of alternative models. It doesn't leave many footprints as the Rockefeller Foundation did, but it is enormously powerful at the present time in shaping the activities of global health overall, and very much enabled by this context of neoliberalism, that is, the privatization impulse, the reorientation of the state in favor of elites. And so here with the former Director General of WHO, Margaret Chan, who just stepped down a few weeks ago, we can have an imaginary cartoon conversation between Dr. Chan and Bill Gates, who is the largest private donor to WHO. So, Dr. Chan, welcome to WHO. We're delighted to have you and Melinda Gates here. And you have Margaret Chan speaking with Bill Gates. Almost looks like he has a halo around his head, beaming, looking very much like he knows what needs to be done in global health. So again, Margaret Chan stands up trying to assert the needs, and you can imagine him saying, yes, very smugly, she may be speaking, but I have the money and the power of the purse strings. And then finally, sheepishly leaving the table, and Margaret Chan delighted to say, yes, finally, he leaves. Now, what might things look like under Dr. Tedros, who has just assumed leadership of WHO? We already know that there has been a close relationship. Bill Gates actually visited his home country of Ethiopia a few years ago when he was the Minister of Foreign Affairs, after he was Minister of Health. There are great concerns in recent years around a framework of engagement with non-state actors, which has ended up welcoming. The idea was to engage with civil society actors and have them participate in the World Health Assembly. But in the end, it has enabled big business, NGOs, and large foundations to garner official roles. So here you have this move that's protested by civil society groups of WHO giving the Gates Foundation an official role. And I find it interesting to compare Gates to recent leaders, and here you see four of them. My own Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau, Gates, Obama, and Francis Hollande. Who will be the last person standing? Well, this one's fallen. This one's finished his term, and it's. I think there's very little doubt that Gates will always remain the last person standing. And so we must revisit the particular perspective of Bill Gates and the Gates Foundation around the socio-political basis for health. And here I think there's a very telling quote from the first time ever a CEO had actually addressed the World Health Assembly in 2005. And here I quote, "Some point to the better health in the developed world and say that we can only improve health when we eliminate poverty. And eliminating poverty is an important goal. But the world didn't have to eliminate poverty in order to eliminate smallpox, and we don't have to eliminate poverty before we reduce malaria. What we need is a vaccine." And so finally, a few take-home points about how philanthrocapitalism erodes global public, or as it's called in Brazil, collective health. The first issue, venture philanthropy's neoliberal aims mean that the state is undergirding the market and transnational corporations. So it is happening in the context of privatization, and the reorientation of regulations and taxes to favor elites, thereby generating ever-increasing inequalities. Philanthrocapitalism also usurps democratic decision-making. Remember, philanthropic donations are tax-deductible, right? So otherwise they would go into public coffers, yet the public has no democratic say about how that money is spent. And furthermore, that money ends up channeling ever greater amounts of public monies through PPPs such as the Global Fund and Gavi Alliance. Philanthrocapitalist entities remain unaccountable. They lack transparency. They are not required necessarily to show how decisions are made. They may release an annual report with vague numbers. These reports can be quite late. They may only go to the tax revenue agency, may not become public, and so on. Philanthrocapitalism and PPPs allot a massive role to these corporate philanthropic partners that both influence and profit from global health. They undermine WHO's mandate to promote health as a fundamental human right. As discussed, they push very narrowly designed technical solutions, ignoring the public and socio-political underpinnings of health and ill health, the societal determinants of health, and ultimately wield undue influence on the global health agenda. So that's all I have to share with you for today. Thank you very much.